Hi, everyone. So I wanted to finally be able to talk to you about intervention planning. The things I want to tell you about this is just maybe some confusion that people are having in terms of what intervention planning is and why you have to do it as an OTA. So I wanted to explain that a little bit. So some of what I think people are thinking is that if you look at the intervention plan, that template that we have, it talks about meaningful roles and occupations, the strengths, the problems, the context, and the safety considerations. Those are all things, yes, that are included in the evaluation that the OT is going to do. But the reason they're part of intervention planning is because many times as an OTA, you may be seeing the patient for the first time and meaning to be doing intervention. So before you can plan an intervention, you have to become familiar with these parts of the patient. It's getting to know the patient and their story. Okay, so this is the first step that you do in terms of your intervention plan for psychosocial practice. So on the screen here, I wanted to help you with that a little bit. And on the screen, I've highlighted a few things that I thought were meaningful in terms of filling out your first page there. So for the first one, I thought it was telling and good information that the OT took the time to tell you that when Glenn is walking outside somewhere and you look at him, he looks like just like anybody else. Okay, you can't tell that there's anything wrong with him. So what that tells us is that physically there probably isn't much wrong with him he's in his early 60s, so he's fairly young compared to some of the clients that you'll probably end up getting in the clinic. So not a lot of physical stuff going on. He's tall, lean, so not a lot of that going on in terms of physical deficits. All right, the next part that I highlighted was this sentence that talks about the medals and commendations for both Glenn's war experience and his work. This seems to be a source of pride for him, and so obviously meaningful roles for him and an occupation in the literal sense of it, the work. So the next part is the strong Jewish faith, also giving you information about who Glenn is. Moving down. On a different note, one of the problems in terms of that was identified when the OT originally got the referral was that he had broken a window, Glenn had, while he was getting undressed. He got his head stuck in a turtleneck shirt, and he panicked when he couldn't figure out how to get out of that. So that tells you something too in terms of problem-solving abilities, in terms of dressing tasks, like what is harder, what is not. So it gives you a little bit of information in there too. The next part is one of the interventions that the OT did was he simplified the room and the routine. And when the OT did that, his anxiety was decreased. Anxiety seems to be a significant problem for Glenn. And that's related to a couple of things. The OT says that he is aware enough that he knows he's losing his ability to do the basic tasks. It also then talks about how he copes with that knowledge. So it goes from reverie, meaning kind of wondering about that or being in wonder, to denial, like denying that there's a problem, and then tremendous fear. So not just afraid of it, but tremendous fear. So when Glenn gets anxious, his problem-solving abilities decrease. And that's likely what happened when he got his head caught in the turtleneck and couldn't figure out what to do about it. Couldn't get out of it. So then he panicked. That tells you important things about Glenn's problem solving and his response to stress. Okay, as far as meaningful occupation, the OT isn't real sure, but she talks about thumbing through his papers. I mean, I'm thinking that this is newspapers or just papers of maybe scrapbooks or, memorabilia for him. And so he does this every day, according to the Sun, I believe. Yes. The OT is questioning whether this is purposeful, like it serves the purpose of kind of reminiscing and the feeling that comes from that, or whether it's helping to sustain his memory, or maybe it's a purposeless activity in that it gives him something to do, so he's just paging through it, not really getting much out of it. OT isn't sure and she doesn't say, and we don't know. So that's something in your intervention plan. You get to determine what you think it is. Your response to either one might be different. So other important things I want you to focus on in terms of Glenn has Alzheimer's, and the OT is sure that you don't want to disturb his routine, yet clutter makes him anxious, and we know that increased anxiety decreases his ability to problem solve and function. So these are the interventions that the OT has already done. She removed non-seasonal clothes or anything else that was seldom used. So really just scaling down and eliminating clutter and really keeping things simple. The other thing that she did was put in an 8.5 by 11 spiral notebook. So this is sort of his journal, his where he can put his thoughts and he can reference it later. He used to take it everywhere with him to be able to kind of give himself self-reminders. So she also did modify his routine she modified his routine as little as possible. They think that's important, and I think you stick with that. That's pretty common with Alzheimer's patients, because when they function best is when they're kind of functioning on automatic pilot. You know, those tasks that they've learned, if they don't have to think about it, and if they can just do it from muscle memory or just out of automatic processes that are used in the brain, that's how they function best. And I think it's important to point out that when she simplified and eliminated the clutter in Glenn's room, he said that he loved it. So we know that's a good intervention and that was helpful. I highlighted the Glenn loved opera because that goes back to that first page of meaningful occupations and roles. And then Glenn I highlighted this next part because it shows that he is able to give insight into some of his problems, and that if he's given adequate time, he can kind of access some of those memories still. I think the problem is, if you look here, it's 4 or 5 minutes, okay? So that's a significant time, and probably time that most caregivers aren't going to stand around and wait for him to recall what he needs to recall. So think of, if you had him in a group, how could you give him cues that would still allow him time to access those memories but facilitate participation. Okay, and then the last part that I highlighted that I thought was important was when the OT went back to see Glenn, there was a problem with the organization of the room that was starting to pile up again. 2 weeks had gone by, and then what she sees is scraps of paper and paper piles had begun to reappear. So that's probably something, whatever that problem is. We know that if the clutter continues to accumulate, then we're back to where we were in terms of clutter causing anxiety and then causing confusion. Okay? So I'm going to pause the recording here and then do another recording to move on.